are structures in the world that exist in a state of paradox, perfectly functional yet universally shunned, geometrically sound yet psychologically impossible. The bridge outside Hollowford was such a structure, spanning a narrow river with mathematical precision while simultaneously dividing the town more effectively than any physical barrier ever could. It had been built 73 years ago by a contractor whose name appeared in town records but whose descendants had long since moved away, constructed from timber and steel according to specifications that met every safety standard of its era and would, according to any objective assessment, meet the standards of the present day as well. Yet no one crossed it. The bridge stretched from the old part of Hollowford, a collection of Victorian houses with peeling paint and sagging porches, streets named after trees that no longer grew there, a main street with more vacant storefronts than operating businesses, to a newer road that connected to the highway and, beyond that, to the wider world of opportunity and escape. Crossing the bridge would cut the journey from one side of town to the other from 23 minutes to 4. Would transform a winding drive through residential streets and pass the defunct mill into a simple, direct connection. But people took the long way. Always. Without discussion. Without posted warnings or municipal ordinances. Just collective, unspoken agreement that the bridge was not to be used. Children growing up in Hollowford absorbed this knowledge the way they absorbed which houses gave the best Halloween candy and which dogs were safe to pet, through observation, through the behavior of adults who never quite explained their reasoning. Teenagers occasionally dared each other to approach the bridge, to touch its railings, to venture a few steps onto its worn planks, but these dares were performed in daylight and never completed. Always, something made them turn back. A sound that might have been wind through the metal supports but didn't quite behave like wind, or a smell like rust and river water but wrong somehow, too organic, or simply a feeling that coalesced in the chest and throat, a tightness, a warning, an instinctive understanding that some thresholds were not meant to be crossed. The bridge had no warning signs because it didn't need them. No broken rails because nothing was broken, at least not in any way that could be photographed or measured. No police tape because no crime had been committed, no accident recorded, no body discovered. No official record of danger because danger, by the metrics the town council understood, did not exist there. Just absence. Just silence. Just the collective detour. Evan Calder noticed this peculiarity on his first day in Hollowford, which arrived in late October when the leaves had mostly fallen and the sky carried that particular quality of gray that suggested winter's approach without quite committing to it. He'd driven into town on a Tuesday afternoon, hired by a development company that saw potential in Hollowford's cheap real estate and proximity to larger cities. His job was infrastructure assessment, surveying roads, bridges, water systems, electrical grids, determining what could support expansion and what would need to be rebuilt. Bridges fascinated Evan in a way he'd never quite been able to articulate to others. Not just their engineering, though he appreciated the mathematics of load distribution and the elegance of suspension, but what they represented. Every bridge was an act of optimism, a declaration that connection was worth the effort of spanning whatever gap nature had created. Every bridge was also an act of faith, that people would trust the structure enough to walk upon it, that the materials would hold, that the design would prove sound not just in theory but in practice, under stress, through storms and time. Evan was 34 years old and had been working as a surveyor for 8 years, moving from town to town as projects demanded, living out of decent hotels and making relationships that were friendly but never quite deep, accumulating experience and salary and a reputation for thoroughness while some part of him, the part he didn't examine too closely, remained permanently in transit, never quite arriving anywhere. He'd noticed the bridge on his drive into town, marked it on his preliminary map, noted its strategic importance for any development plan. Then, setting up at his hotel room, a modest establishment called the Hollow in whose name he found appropriately evocative, he'd pulled up his survey maps and traffic flow data and noticed something odd. Every GPS route, every local's directions, every suggested path between the two sides of town took the long way around. As if the bridge simply didn't exist in their mental geography. Professional curiosity made him note this anomaly. Something else, something less rational, made him decide to investigate it immediately rather than following his usual methodical process of starting at the town center and working outward. That evening, after a meal at the town's only functioning diner where he'd eaten meatloaf that tasted like every small-town diner's meatloaf and drunk coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since morning, Evan asked the waitress, a woman in her 50s named Carol whose name tag was pinned slightly crooked on her uniform, about the bridge. The old bridge, he'd said, keeping his tone casual, professional. The one over the river on the east side. Is it structurally sound? Should I prioritize it in my assessment? Carol had been refilling his coffee cup. She stopped mid-pour, the stream of dark liquid faltering before she caught herself and completed the action. The bridge is fine, she said, her voice carefully neutral. So it's safe to cross. It's structurally sound. The same phrase, but different emphasis. Then she'd moved away to attend to another table, conversation clearly concluded. But an older man 2 stools down, grizzled, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, nursing what looked like his 3rd or 4th cup of coffee, had caught Evan's eye. Nothing's wrong with the bridge, he said, apparently feeling the need to elaborate on Carol's truncated response. Evan waited. The man seemed to be wrestling with whether to say more. People just don't cross it, he added finally, as if this explained everything. Then, more quietly, almost to himself, haven't for years. Why not? The man's jaw worked, chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. Other diners had fallen quiet, that particular quality of silence that comes when everyone is carefully not listening. Finally, just don't. You'll see. And that had been the end of the conversation. The diner's ambient noise resumed, silverware on plates, a distant radio, the hiss of the coffee maker, but the silence around the bridge remained, a void in the middle of ordinary sound. That night, unable to sleep despite the long drive, Evan found himself walking through Hollowford's empty streets toward the bridge. The town had few streetlights and fewer still that functioned, creating pockets of illumination separated by long stretches of darkness. Houses glowed with the blue flicker of televisions through drawn curtains. A dog barked twice, then fell silent. Somewhere, a door closed with a sound that seemed to carry too far in the still air. The bridge appeared gradually as Evan approached, first as a darker shape against the dark sky, then with increasing definition as his eyes adjusted, the arc of its span, the vertical posts of its railings, the cross-hatching of support beams underneath. The river it crossed was narrow, perhaps 30 feet across, moving slowly enough that its surface appeared more like dark glass than water. No moon overhead to cast reflections, just the ambient light pollution from distant towns creating a faint gray luminescence that suggested the shape of things without quite revealing them. Evan stood at the bridge's entrance, where asphalt transitioned to wooden planking. The wood was weathered but not rotten, worn smooth by decades of weather but structurally intact. The steel bolts holding everything together showed rust but not deterioration, the kind of surface oxidation that actually protected the metal beneath, a patina that spoke of age without weakness. He pulled out his phone and activated its flashlight, sweeping the beam across the bridge's surface. No holes. No significant cracks. The railings stood straight and secure. By every metric he understood, this bridge was perfectly functional. More than functional, it was solid, well-built, a testament to craftsmanship from an era when infrastructure was constructed to last generations. Evan stepped onto the bridge. The sound began immediately. It wasn't a creak, wood settling, metal contracting, the normal protests of an aging structure. It was a whisper. Or many whispers, layered and overlapping, creating a texture of sound that seemed to come from the bridge itself, from its bones and joints, from the spaces between planks and the hollows of its supports. Low. Indistinct. Like many voices trying simultaneously to speak and to remain hidden, to be heard and to stay silent. Evan froze mid-step, his weight distributed between his trailing foot on solid ground and his leading foot on the bridge's first plank. The whispers didn't increase in volume but somehow became more present, more insistent, as if his presence had activated something dormant. He should have stepped back. Every survival instinct cultivated through millions of years of human evolution screamed at him to retreat, to return to safety, to abandon this investigation. But Evan had spent his adult life overriding instinct with analysis, trusting data over feeling, believing that rational assessment could explain any phenomenon if applied with sufficient rigor. He moved forward, committing his full weight to the bridge, letting his trailing foot leave the security of solid ground. The whispers shifted, reconfiguring themselves around his presence like water flowing around an obstacle. Not louder but more focused. More aware. Evan walked slowly, each step deliberate, his flashlight beam sweeping left and right, looking for the source, speakers hidden beneath planks, some elaborate prank, a natural phenomenon he hadn't encountered before. But the beam revealed only what it should: wood grain, metal fasteners, the understructure of a perfectly ordinary bridge. Except it wasn't ordinary. With each step toward the bridge's center, the temperature dropped. Subtly at first, just a coolness that might have been wind off the water, but increasingly pronounced until Evan could see his breath forming small clouds that dissipated sluggishly, as if the air itself resisted movement. The whispers were becoming clearer. Not individual words but emotional content, regret, thick and cloying like smoke. Hesitation that felt like paralysis. Fear that tasted metallic. And underneath all of it, a question repeated infinitely in voices that might have been his own or might have been everyone who'd ever stood at a threshold and not crossed it. What if? What if? What if? Halfway across, Evan stopped walking. Not because he chose to. Because his legs refused to continue. As if the bridge itself had become quicksand, as if forward movement required more energy than he possessed, as if every unmade choice in his life had manifested as physical weight pressing down on him. And the memories came. The job offer he'd received 4 years ago. Better position, better pay, in a city where he'd always wanted to live. He'd held the acceptance letter for 2 weeks, revising it, perfecting it, telling himself he needed to be certain before making such a significant change. Then the position had been filled by someone who didn't hesitate, and Evan had stayed where he was, telling himself it was the prudent choice, the safe choice, while knowing in some unexamined part of himself that it was the coward's choice. The relationship with Sarah, brilliant Sarah with her sharp humor and her patience that had eventually, inevitably, run out. The night she'd asked him directly, "Do you see a future with me, or am I just someone to pass time with?" And he'd fumbled the answer, had said something about not being sure, about needing more time to figure things out, when the truth was he did see a future with her but was terrified of committing to it, of making himself vulnerable to that kind of need. She'd left 3 weeks later, and he'd let her go, standing silent in his doorway as she walked away. The conversation with his father he'd meant to have for years, about things that had happened in childhood, about distance that had calcified between them, about forgiveness that needed speaking aloud even if it couldn't undo the past. He'd rehearsed it countless times, planned the right words, waited for the right moment. And then his father had died, suddenly, and the conversation became permanently impossible, all those rehearsed words turning into weight he'd carry forever. The bridge remembered. Or Evan remembered through the bridge. Or the distinction between himself and the structure had become blurred in a way that made classification meaningless. Every hesitation. Every threshold he'd approached but not crossed. Every moment where choice had been required and he'd chosen paralysis instead, telling himself he was being careful, being thoughtful, being rational, when really he was just being afraid. The whispers weren't voices from the bridge. They were echoes of his own internal monologue, the endless rationalizations and justifications he'd used to avoid action, avoid commitment, avoid the vulnerability of full engagement with his own life. Every, "I'll do it tomorrow," and "I need more time," and "I'm not ready yet," had accumulated here, had been stored in this space between one side and the other, had built up like sediment until they created a barrier as real as any physical obstacle. Evan's legs trembled. His breath came short and shallow. The temperature had dropped to the point where the river's vapor rose in visible coils, surrounding the bridge in a fog that hadn't existed moments before. Or had always existed, visible only to those who stopped halfway, who stood in the liminal space between one life and another and confronted all the ways they'd refused to live fully. He understood now why no one crossed this bridge. Not because of danger in any conventional sense, but because crossing required confronting every unmade choice, every abandoned possibility, every version of yourself you could have become but didn't because courage failed at the critical moment. To reach the other side meant acknowledging all of this. Meant feeling the full weight of a life lived in perpetual retreat. Meant accepting that you had agency and had consistently chosen not to exercise it, and that this pattern had shaped your existence more profoundly than any action you'd actually taken. The whispers crescendoed, not in volume but in emotional intensity. Evan felt them in his chest, in his throat, in the tightness of his jaw and the burning behind his eyes. Every regret. Every what if. Every road not taken and decision deferred and truth not spoken. He had two choices: turn back, return to the safety of the known, continue the pattern that had defined his adult life. Or move forward, carry this weight to the other side, acknowledge it without being destroyed by it. Evan took another step. The whispers became screams, soundless screams, felt rather than heard, pressure building in his skull and chest until he thought he might fragment. All the futures he'd abandoned rose up around him like ghosts, the version of himself who'd taken that job and built a career he could be proud of. The version who'd committed to Sarah and learned what it meant to be truly known by another person. The version who'd spoken honestly with his father and carried peace instead of regret. These alternative selves weren't reproaches. They were just present. Real in their own way. Lost possibilities that retained a kind of substance even in their unreality. Evan ran. Not back towards safety, that path was closed now, or he'd closed it himself by coming this far. Forward. Through the pressure and the cold and the weight of everything he'd avoided becoming. Each step was harder than it should have been, each movement requiring a choice, an active decision to continue rather than stop and calcify into another hesitation, another person-shaped monument to inaction. The fog grew denser. The planks beneath his feet felt insubstantial, as if the bridge were dissolving under him or he were dissolving into it. The line between the structure and his own body blurred. He was made of wood and steel and unmade choices, he was the bridge, he was everything that stopped halfway. And then his foot struck solid ground. The sound ceased immediately. Not fading, just gone, cut off as cleanly as if he'd closed a door. The fog dissipated so quickly it seemed to evaporate rather than drift away. The temperature normalized with an almost audible snap. Evan stumbled forward 3 more steps, then fell to his knees on the asphalt, gasping, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion and something else, something like grief but sharper, more immediate. He turned to look back at the bridge. It sat there, perfectly ordinary, perfectly still, showing no sign of the experience he'd just endured. Moonlight broke through the clouds at that moment, illuminating the structure with cool silver light that made it look almost benign, almost welcoming. But Evan could see what he hadn't seen before, a thin layer of dust on the planks, undisturbed except for the trail of his footprints. No one had crossed this bridge in a very long time. And he understood why the townspeople avoided it. Why they took the long way without explaining. Why some knowledge had to be experienced rather than communicated. Evan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his hotel room with all the lights on, laptop open but unused, phone in his hand but no one to call. Outside his window, Hollowford slept the sleep of small towns, deeply, innocently, as if bridges were just bridges and the world operated according to rules that could be written down and followed. He tried to convince himself it had been a panic attack. Exhaustion. Stress. Some combination of psychological factors that had manifested as sensory experience. But he could still feel the cold on his skin, could still hear the whisper's emotional weight, could still sense the presence of all those unmade choices gathered in one place like a monument to human hesitation. At dawn, he packed his things mechanically, moving through the routine without conscious thought. Checkout was supposed to be at 11, but he brought his key down at 6, found Carol at the desk. She apparently worked every shift, or the hotel was too small to employ multiple people. "Leaving already?" she asked, unsurprised. "Your survey's complete." "I'm recommending the project be suspended," Evan said, his voice hoarse from not speaking all night. "Infrastructure issues." Carol's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested understanding. "The bridge?" Evan nodded. You crossed it. Not a question. Yes. And you're leaving. Yes. She processed his early checkout without further comment, but as he was turning to go, she said quietly, others have crossed. Over the years. They all leave. Usually that same day. What happens to them? After they leave? Carol considered the question. I don't know. They don't come back. But... She paused, weighing whether to continue. I have a cousin. Crossed the bridge 20 years ago. Moved to Seattle. Last I heard, she's happy. Running her own business. Has kids. Seems like she's living the life she was supposed to live. And the ones who don't cross. Who take the long way their whole lives. Carol's smile was sad. They stay here. Safe. Small. Never quite moving forward. She glanced around the modest hotel lobby as if it represented something larger. There's nothing wrong with safe and small, necessarily. But for some people, staying safe costs more than they realize. Evan left Hollowford as the sun was rising, driving the long way around because he couldn't bring himself to cross the bridge again, not yet, maybe not ever. In his rearview mirror, the town receded into morning mist, becoming memory, becoming something that had happened to him rather than something he was part of. But something had changed. He felt it in his chest, in the way he gripped the steering wheel, in the trajectory of his thoughts. The weight of unmade choices hadn't disappeared, he still carried every hesitation, every abandoned possibility, but it felt different now. Acknowledged. Named. No longer something he could pretend wasn't there. Evan never returned to Hollowford, but he learned to recognize the bridge's lesson in his daily life, that invisible threshold where forward movement requires confronting what you've been avoiding, where progress demands honesty about all the ways you've been standing still. He took the next job offer that felt right, not perfect, not risk-free, but aligned with something he wanted rather than something he was settling for. He called people back when they reached out instead of letting connections fade through benign neglect. He had difficult conversations, spoke uncomfortable truths, allowed himself to be seen in ways that felt vulnerable and terrifying and necessary, and sometimes, in moments of hesitation when he felt himself beginning to stop, to rationalize, to choose the safety of inaction over the risk of commitment, he remembered the bridge and the choice it had forced: turn back and remain who you've always been, or move forward and discover who you might become. The bridge outside Hollowford still stands. Still intact. Still avoided by the town's residents who've learned that some structures are best left uncrossed, who've chosen the long way and built their lives around that choice, and for whom this works, mostly, except on certain nights when they lie awake wondering what exists on the other side. But once in a while, someone crosses. Usually outsiders who don't know better, or locals who've reached a point where the long way has become untenable, where the safety of stopping has become its own kind of danger. They reach the other side changed. Shaken. Carrying knowledge that can't be unlearned, that every life contains infinite unmade versions of itself, and that the gap between who you are and who you could have been is bridged only by the courage to keep moving when everything in you screams to stop. Some of these people leave town immediately, fleeing toward possibilities they'd been avoiding. Others stay but live differently, no longer content with the small and safe, no longer willing to let fear masquerade as prudence. And the bridge waits, patient and precise, its wooden planks marked with dust and occasional footprints, its steel supports holding firm against weather and time, its purpose unchanged, to test whether those who approach it are willing to confront the cumulative weight of their own hesitation, whether they'll choose to carry that weight forward into transformation or turn back into the comfortable stagnation of lives lived halfway. Some paths terrify us not because they're broken, but because they force us to choose. This is perhaps the deepest horror we can experience, not external threat but internal confrontation. Not physical danger but psychological reckoning. The bridge outside Hollowford is a metaphor, but what it represents is devastatingly real. We all have these bridges in our lives, thresholds we approach but don't cross, commitments we consider but don't make, truths we recognize but don't speak, changes we contemplate but don't enact. And each time we stop halfway, Each time we turn back towards safety, a piece of ourselves calcifies into permanence. The person we could have become remains forever theoretical. The life we might have lived stays safely hypothetical. This is comfortable. Stopping is always more comfortable than continuing. The known, however unsatisfying, feels safer than the unknown with its infinite variables and uncontrollable outcomes. We tell ourselves we're being reasonable, being careful, waiting for the right moment or the perfect circumstances. But what we're really doing is avoiding the bridge, avoiding the confrontation with our own capacity for inaction, our talent for self-preservation that sometimes becomes self-imprisonment. The bridge doesn't care about your reasons. Doesn't accept excuses or rationalizations. It simply reflects back everything you've avoided becoming, every choice you've deferred, every moment where courage was required and you chose comfort instead. And here's the terrible, liberating truth: you have to cross it anyway. Maybe not literally, maybe not today, but eventually life requires movement. Eventually staying still becomes untenable. Eventually the long way around reveals itself as just another form of stopping, a horizontal paralysis that looks like progress but isn't. So cross. Not recklessly, the bridge demands acknowledgement, not ignorance. Not without fear. Fear is appropriate when confronting the weight of everything you've been avoiding. But cross despite the fear, through the fear, carrying the fear as part of the weight you'll bear to the other side. Accept that the person you are is shaped as much by roads not taken as roads traveled. Accept that you've stopped, repeatedly, and that this pattern has cost you possibilities you'll never fully know. Accept that hesitation has been your default mode and that this has protected you from some suffering but also prevented you from some joy. And then move forward anyway. Take the job that terrifies you. Have the conversation you've been avoiding. Commit to the relationship that requires vulnerability. Speak the truth that might change everything. Make the choice you've been deferring. The bridge is waiting. Your bridge, whatever form it takes in your specific life. The threshold between who you've been and who you might become. The space where all your unmade choices have accumulated, creating weight that will either stop you permanently or, if you have the courage to acknowledge and carry it, transform you. You can take the long way. You can avoid crossing for your entire life. Many people do. They build satisfying existences around their hesitations, find ways to feel content with small and safe, convince themselves that the unexamined life is actually fine, actually enough. But you're reading this, which suggests you already know better. You already feel the weight of your own stopped moments. You already sense there's another side you haven't reached, a version of yourself that exists only in potential, a life that remains unlived because you've been standing still. Cross the bridge. Not someday. Now. Today. This moment. Acknowledge what you've been avoiding. Feel the weight of your unmade choices. Let yourself experience the full horror of realizing how much of your life has been spent in retreat. And then cross anyway. Move through that horror toward whatever exists on the other side. It won't be easy. It won't be comfortable. You'll be changed by the crossing in ways you can't predict. But you'll also be living. Fully. Finally. Without the burden of perpetual hesitation, without the weight of infinite unmade possibilities. The bridge is not your enemy. Your fear of crossing it is. Cross wisely. Be story wise.